So let's start first with the legacy of Justice Kennedy, and let's, if we could, take a slightly different take, because typically if you read in the newspaper, you read about a lot of the social issues, where he was on abortion and the Casey case and things like that. What about that affected business and financial markets? What was his legacy there?
You know, he was a pretty solid pro-business conservative jurist. On antitrust issues, he tended to try to limit the sweep of the antitrust laws, securities laws. He was, generally speaking, for narrower liability. He didn't want to go beyond whatever the Congress provided in a statute in terms of liability. He was not a big fan of large litigation, so he wasn't a big fan of class actions. So I would think from the business community's perspective, getting somebody like him would be extraordinarily important in that sense. On the other hand, the problem with conservatives is that they come in different stripes. Some are more business oriented, as I would have described Justice Kennedy. Others are more ideologically oriented, which more often than not probably benefits the business community, but there's certainly on some issues it won't.
So it's interesting, in some ways he did side with the majority in striking down some regulations. For example, that one involving baking the wedding cake that came out a little bit ago, that was striking down really, or not implying a Colorado state piece of regulation using the Constitution. In general, was he receptive to claims that regulators had overstepped their boundaries?
Yes, he was, and obviously the Masterpiece Cake Shop is overlaid between sort of really complicated First Amendment and LGBT rights, and so it's sort of odd in that respect. But I think if you just look at him as somebody who would find that certain state laws were preempted, that Dormant Commerce Clause, which is something in the Constitution that the business community relies on heavily, I mean those were principles that he applied in a regularly business way. They had to sometimes balance his sort of states' rights preferences or the desire to allow the states to regulate to some extent. But in general, given an opportunity to find a path that would make the lives of the business community somewhat less complicated, he tended to find that way.
And even as we reflect on his legacy, we look forward. The game has begun of speculation. There's a list here. The president, by the way, himself has put out a list and been pretty open about what's on it. But looking forward, not asking you to pick who it's going to be, as you look at those candidates that have been named, how would they be likely to change the court, specifically as it deals with business, or would it be more of the same from Justice Kennedy?
Well, I think it would be similar in the sense that I don't expect that there would be a fundamental change on questions of class actions and antipathy to large litigation. Probably not a difference in terms of, say, intellectual property. And in general, that's one area where, at least from the defendant's side of patent litigation, he was pretty favorable across the board. The one area that I've worried about, and it's not limited specifically to Justice Kennedy, is just the fact that the court hasn't revisited the question of what limits to place on punitive damages for quite some time, and the composition of the court's changed pretty dramatically. And if you go back to the decision where the court actually imposed limits, the two justices who refused to impose limits were Justices Scalia and Thomas. And so if the newer justices were to kind of follow that approach, saying that the Due Process Clause has no business there, then the business community could easily find itself with a 5 or 6 member majority saying, no, sky's the limit in terms of punitive damages. That obviously would not be a positive development for business.
It struck me, Carter, and I wonder if it has you as well, that on the Supreme Court at this point, I don't believe there's anyone who has substantial corporate experience, have been in a boardroom as a lawyer or otherwise. And I wonder whether there are any candidates that actually have been in a boardroom, have done things in the corporate world, who understand really the inner workings of a corporation. And does that make a difference?
Well, yeah, clearly it would make a difference. I mean, you can go back to your old boss, Justice Powell, who had an enormous amount of experience in that area, and I think it showed on a pretty regular basis. Justice Kennedy obviously had some of that as well. As I think about most of the candidates, without sort of sitting down there and systematically analyzing them, and most of them are either academic or were academics, and then or have been judges for quite some time. And for better or worse, if people who are judges tend not to be focused on boardroom activities. They are cloistered to a certain extent, and that's just the fact of life.
So, Carter, without regard to the moment of who actually replaces Justice Kennedy, what are the biggest issues do you think that might affect business that may be coming up? You mentioned punitive damages already. You mentioned also antitrust law. What are the things that we can look forward to, and particularly being mindful of the fact that President Trump and his administration have been really in favor of deregulating, dialing back on regulations? Are there major regulatory issues or Commerce Clause issues that we might be expect to come up in the next term or two?
Oh, I don't have any doubt that the environmental issues are going to be all over the place at this point. The President and the EPA have engaged in a fairly systematic effort to deregulate a substantial amount of the environmental legislation. I think that'll be a huge, not the legislation, but regulation. Those issues are going to make their way through the D.C. Circuit and back up. So I think that's going to be one for, absolutely. I think class actions will continue to be an issue that the lower courts are struggling with, and that the court itself is going to have to evaluate. And obviously, from the business community's perspective, they hope that the justices who had lined up to kind of more clearly return to the Rule 23 that was adopted 60 years ago will be the approach taken going forward.